Welcome to the final episode of the WinShape Marriage Podcast for Season 2. It's hard to believe we are already at the end of Season 2.
Yeah, we made it. And Marlee, it's been a great season. We've talked with so many different marriage guests in a wide range of seasons and topics. And I know for me personally, I've walked away from each episode with really great marriage tools to go back and use in my own marriage. And today I wanted to maybe spend some time with you going through some of our favorite moments from Season 2.
Yeah.
And compiling maybe 4 or 5 that we really enjoyed throughout the season.
Yeah. We definitely had some great guests on. We had some people in the marriage and family space experts out there. We had some WinShape Foundation team members, even internal WinShape Marriage team members, and you and I having some conversations as well. So lots of things to pull from. But yep, like Rob said, we took a listen back over Season 2 and compiled some of our top moments. So we're going to break those down for you guys in this episode.
Yeah, let's do it.
Rob, we are recording the final episode of Season 2 of the WinShape Marriage Podcast. It's been such a fun season.
Yeah, it really has been fun. And when I was thinking through some of my favorite moments from Season 2, the first one that stuck out to me was all the way back at the beginning at episode 1 in our conversation with Gary Chapman.
Yeah.
And he was talking about this idea of a love tank. And so let's go ahead and roll the clip.
Love does not begin with a feeling. It begins with an attitude. And the attitude is, I want to enrich your life. In any way I can, I want to enrich your life. And in this area of meeting the emotional need for love, which we all have, if I can find out what does that for you, then I want to do that. And so you can learn to speak any of these languages. When you do, the love tank is full.
So the thing I love so much about this is this idea of your spouse has a love language, and as your role in marriage is to keep that love tank full.
Yeah.
And so just kind of monitoring like, hey, my spouse really likes quality time, or they really like words of appreciation, or whatever it may be. And then just kind of keep a monitor on like, hey, how is that tank doing? Like, are they feeling appreciated? Are they feeling like we're spending a lot of quality time together? Are they feeling like we really have a lot of physical touch? Whatever it may be, just keeping like a pulse on where your spouse is at, and then working to meet that. But I really enjoyed just this idea of making sure that you are meeting your spouse's needs when it comes to their love language.
Yeah. And I thought when I think about how he described this, the most obvious, like natural tie for me was just thinking about like the gas tank in your car.
Yeah.
And you have to keep your gas tank full.
Yeah.
And it's not always going to be at like, it's impossible to keep the gas tank at 100 out of 100 all the time because you're driving. But thinking about the love tank in that same way of just doing that kind of weekly check-in of like, hey, where's your love tank? Like, are you running on fumes? Like, have I not done my job well? And like you are feeling like you're on fumes and not really receiving love well? Or are you like halfway full? Like, can I make a couple of deposits in there?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I did love that episode with Dr. Chapman. It was really awesome.
Yeah. And in a similar fashion, if your tank is empty, you're not going to be running at full steam ahead.
Yeah.
And so just be cognizant of like, hey, if you see your spouse is kind of in a different space, or maybe they're feeling stressed or something is off, like going back and measuring that love tank is a great way of getting a pulse on where they're at. But
totally.
Let's hear your first piece of feedback.
Yeah, so I really loved the episode that I did with Bradley Joseph, our resident play expert at WinShape, and talking about play. And it was so enlightening hearing all the different play types. But the quote that I love from him was when he was describing one of the benefits of play in your marriage. So let's hear what Bradley had to say.
Yeah.
And even going along those lines, when you have that opportunity to actually play with each other and you engage in that, you see each other in more of that playful manner and that fun manner. So when you look at your spouse, you're thinking, oh, fun, rather than oh man, the stress or whatever it may be, and other things along those lines. You're more likely to even be forgiving one towards another, because when you're in that state of seriousness, it's like, oh, you did something wrong. Now we have to fix it. Whereas when you're playing, even if you make a mistake, it's like, it's okay. Let's try that again. And that's more of the mentality that you have when you're engaging one with another. So I've seen it even for my wife and I when we're in more of those playful states, how much more sensitive we are to each other, how much more we're leaning in versus leaning back, and just so many other factors that kind of play off of that.
So what I love from that was just this idea of, and we kind of talked about it in our marriage advice that changed our life episode too. And I'm realizing the connection here now, but this idea that when you have that foundation of playfulness in your marriage, that you are so much more likely to be gracious and forgiving in your marriage relationship. And so just a benefit of getting out and playing together and having just playful and like lighthearted moments together helps you in those tougher moments to be more understanding and compassionate and gracious.
Yeah, I feel like you almost need those lighthearted moments to balance out the hard times or the hard conversations.
Yeah.
And so I agree, like having that trust and having that, playful time together is a great way of balancing things out so it doesn't feel like it's hard all the time. Like you actually have that lighthearted side.
Absolutely. And if you're hearing this for the first time and you're like, I missed that episode, what is playing together? Then definitely go back and give it a listen, because there were like just such rich information about how we play differently with our spouse. And so if you don't know how to play well with your spouse, then you might be setting yourself up not for success in those moments if you're like not even knowing how to play well together.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
All right. Next up on my list was from our conversation with Greg Smalley. And this was actually our Christmas episode, which if you missed it, Marlee and I went through and talked to a wide range of couples on different seasons of marriage about how they handle the conversation around holiday planning and conversations with in-laws. And this piece of advice is relevant for Christmas, but it's also relevant far beyond that. And it's Greg Smalley talking about prioritizing your spouse. Let's hear it.
Yeah, if I could go back and talk to the younger me, I would encourage me to really make sure, especially in those early years of our marriage, that my wife Erin knows thoroughly, fully, that everyone knows that she is my loyalty. She is my top priority. And that was tricky for me. I had to learn that, and we all have to learn that, and that, but I wish I could have learned that faster to make sure that she knows, hey, as we go into my family, and be around my family, you're still my number one. And therefore, what would it look like? How would you know that I'm choosing you as number one? What would I be doing? And just have that sort of conversation. Because, there were some things that I did early on that just left her wondering and confused. And so just being more intentional, going, Erin, you're my top priority, man. You're I love my family, but you're number one. And what would that look like? What would I be doing, not doing, that would be evidence that you are number one? Yeah. And just to guard that and to emphasize that and to reinforce that around. Sometimes we've got to make those comments and things to our family. Hey, before I answer the question you just asked, let me check with my wife.
So Marlee, the thing I really love about this is taking an inventory of what are my actions that are showing my spouse that they're a priority. And of course, this is relevant around Christmas time, like when you're visiting family, not saying like, hey, my family's my priority, but actually like checking in and saying like, what are my actions that are showing to my spouse, like you're my priority above my family. But I think this also goes into every season of my life and marriage. Like, hey, when it comes to work, like what can I do to show my spouse that they're my priority above work or above other things? And I just thought it was like a really encouraging message.
Yeah, I loved how he was saying like, or how I thought about it tangibly is like, I think his wife's Erin, right?
Yeah.
So like, how is Erin either seeing or like tangibly feeling that I am placing her, first, that I'm prioritizing her? And it definitely was a great challenge for me to, and I think, to your point, it's a challenge that can extend throughout the calendar year of how am I tangibly showing Cody that above work, above my friends, above my other priorities, above church or whatever, that he is the number one priority.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting too of thinking like, hey, opening the door to your spouse to give you feedback on that.
Yeah.
Like, hey, do you feel like I've been prioritizing you lately? What are some ways that you feel like I have? What are some ways that you feel like I haven't? And just kind of having that conversation could be really interesting.
Yeah. I do want to point out, I was recognizing as I was just talking now that do want to make sure though that we're not prioritizing our spouse above the Lord too.
Yeah.
Like we've talked about that before of, the Lord first, then our spouse, then our kids and, other families. So I did want to make that quick distinction because I think as I was talking, it might sound like I was literally saying
above church,
Cody above everything. But the important thing is that I have, a good relationship with the Lord. And then that allows me to tangibly on earth prioritize Cody well.
Yeah.
So I want to make that distinction.
That's great.
Okay, so I loved this episode that we had Dr. David Banks on, and you had to listen all the way to the end. This clip came at the very end of the episode because the episode was more about this idea of the honeymoon phase and the 7-year itch.
Mm-hmm.
But then you were the host for that one, and you actually teed up this question at the end where you said, no matter how long you've been married, what would be a piece of advice that you would have for any couple? And so this was what David Banks had to say.
Regardless of how long you've been married, I think it's always important for a couple to really just take some time and say, how do we stay connected? What do we need? Whether you've been married 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, let's just make sure that we're not in the assumption role. What is the assumption role? Well, they know I love them. He knows he's awesome. How often do you share that? When it gets to the point where you assume everything and you're not sharing, that's letting you know you're heading down not a healthy path. It is important. Yeah, he knows he does the lawn well. He knows it. But it definitely helps him tremendously when you look out and say, hey, babe, you did a great job on that lawn.
100%.
You did a great job. He likes that. So it is important that couples really kind of pause and reset. I say that a lot. Let's pause and just reset. And let's just, what do we need to do to just keep this connection tight?
Yeah.
And doing things to bring the fun back in, those are little things that I always would share with couples, regardless of how long they've been married.
So what I love about what he was sharing there is he's right. Like the piece of advice he gave does go across the board for any couple, no matter how long they've been married, which is just this idea of staying connected to them and not catching yourself in an assuming role. And I think that is so easy to do as you get comfortable in marriage. And in this context, we're talking about, around that 7-year itch and things as you're getting comfortable. You've been together 7 years of just assuming like, well, they know I love them. So like when you hang up the phone, if you're, at the store and you call and you're like, hey, I have on my list like noodles, but I think I saw noodles like in the pantry. Like, can we double check? And they're like, yeah. Oh, we do have noodles. It's like, okay, thanks. Bye.
Yeah.
And even in that moment thinking like, okay, thanks. I love you. Bye. Like I'll be home in a second. And that was just a challenge for me of just remembering like, hey, make sure that you're being intentional in what you're sharing with them and that you don't catch yourself in an assuming role of, well, they they know I love them.
Yeah.
Like, we're married. Like, they know that they're doing a good job. They don't always know.
That really is a great point of reminding your spouse that you love them. And the thing I love about too is it's not just saying it too, but it's also like modeling that in your actions.
Yeah.
Like you might be in year 7 or year 15 and thinking like, oh, of course they know I love them. I don't need to give them flowers or do little sweet things here and there.
Mm-hmm.
But like, no, it truly does mean a lot, even in that stage of marriage. And so I think that's a great reminder for sure.
Yeah. I think about like the grocery store example, and it's just a good challenge for me, even if I'm at the store. You know, it doesn't have to be every time, but it's like, hey, I know that Cody loves Snickers. So maybe this time, like if I'm thinking about it, you know, grab the Snickers. Like it's right there, you know, just grab it and just be intentional. Be like, hey, I was picking up our, you know, all the ingredients for the spaghetti and I got you the Snickers bar too.
No, that's great.
Yeah. What do you have from season 2? What was another standout moment for you?
Yeah, so next up from me comes from our episode for Thanksgiving. I was talking with Genee Francis, who's one of our team members, and we were talking about this idea of gratitude. Mm-hmm. And there was one thing that she said that really stuck out to me. So let's give it a listen.
Okay.
I want to dig in a little bit on this idea of how you think about your spouse and how your spouse thinks about themselves and how gratitude can help encourage them in that. I think about how every spouse, like every husband wants to be a good husband.
Sure.
But they might not necessarily believe that they're a good husband. Mm-hmm. And I think through gratitude, it really opens the door to help your spouse tell a different story about themselves that they might not necessarily think before. Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about how in marriage we can support one another and help ourselves tell better stories about who we are?
Sure. You know, I think sometimes in marriage, we don't have a blueprint. And so oftentimes we're going through life and we don't really know, you know, how we're doing in this thing. Like we're doing the best we can with what we know, right? The tools that we enter in. And so I think sometimes we can use this culture of gratitude or even just the opportunity to celebrate our spouse to kind of help them keep a pulse on how things are going.
Yeah.
But sometimes, you know, we're moving about, we're, you know, the logistics of day to day and kids and balancing work and all the things. Sometimes it's hard to really know, where do I sit in my spouse's eyes and what are the things that I could be doing differently? And I think that showing gratitude and saying thank you and I appreciate you. And you know, that little thing you did yesterday made all the difference and really brightened my day. That there's this reciprocity effect that happens. So even if my spouse is not feeling that or thinking that or in that same space or maybe even feeling a little insecure, those words could completely change their outlook. It could change how they're feeling about in their interactions with you and just help them to know that like, I'm on the right track and this is, you know, this is good.
So Marlee, the thing I really enjoyed about this quote is it really highlights your ability as a spouse to speak truth and life into your spouse.
Yeah.
And so I think you have the opportunity to provide encouragement or provide support in whatever different ways. Like if you sense that later on in the episode, Genee talks about this idea of defeated speech. Like your spouse is talking down on themselves or maybe they lack confidence or whatever. Like if you sense that from your spouse, you can go in and speak truth and uplift them and say like, hey, I see you in this and you're actually great at this thing, whatever it may be. And so then when you do that, it invites your spouse to receive that feedback and then in their brain to slowly start telling a different story about themselves from that. Like, hey, maybe I am good at this, or maybe the Lord does love me in that way, you know? Yeah. And so I think it's a really cool invitation.
Yeah. It's really cool that we as spouses have the opportunity to be Christ with skin on for our spouse and speak life into them. Like we're the closest person in like physical proximity, physical person on earth with them. You know, we're doing life with them. We're their teammate. And so it's a high calling that we have to be able to just speak into them what's true about them.
Yeah.
So,
no, that's a great point. Yeah, for sure.
So this is kind of similar to that. And we had the Rienows on. Amy and Rob Rienow. This was earlier on in the season, and the whole episode was this idea of what I wish I knew earlier in marriage. And one of the points that they made was, I wish that earlier on I had focused more on the positive and kind of the story that I was telling about my spouse. So we'll give a listen to what Amy had to say.
I wish we had focused more on the positive. When you say that, what do you mean?
I can give you a lot of examples of that, that through many lessons and watching some older people in my life and seeing the difference between an older person and an older couple growing in joy versus an older couple growing, in more negativity and more sadness and more bitterness. I mean, I feel like the Lord gave me a lot of living examples. And the reality is, growing in joy has a lot to do about what you're fixated on in your present. So if you, as a wife, are always looking at the ways that your husband is falling short, and you're like thinking about that, that's what's going to stay fixed. That's hardwired in there. I have one really great example of this at the Lord. A story. We would often go visit my grandparents in Texas, in Houston, and we would go to Galveston, and we would enjoy visiting them. Like, we didn't have a lot of money, so visiting family for vacation was one of the ways we spent our time. And we took RW there. He was only 2. I must have been pregnant with my second. And went to the Galveston beach, and Rob had changed him in the changing room, and and he had left RW's brand new bathing suit in the changing room. And so when we left, and of course you didn't realize it until, it was too late to go back and get it. And, we're young ministry, like I don't have a lot of money, and I was excited to get this suit. I'm really frustrated. They left it. I'm really frustrated. Okay. Well, we were back in Galveston probably 10 years after that at that beach. And I'd remembered that trip. And I just remember I looked at that beach house and I was like, oh, that's where Rob left that suit. Okay, well, that's when the Holy Spirit convicted me, because I was like, wow, that's what I remember about that trip. I mean, we had a lot of wonderful times on that trip. And here I'm back at that same place. And what stuck in my mind? The suit that my husband left. So that's when the Lord really just waved the red flag. The Holy Spirit was just like, okay, is that really what you want to remember from that trip? Because, so you have a choice as a couple of what you're going to fixate on every day. And this is not just in the spouse relationship, but the relationship with your kids, relationships with your friends and your family. If you choose to fixate on all the things that you are discontent with about in that relationship, you are setting yourself up for not growing in joy, but in growing more in negativity and bitterness.
So I think what stands out for me from this is it's not just focusing on the positive, but it was just this idea of what you are fixated on, like in your present moment. So it's one thing to just say, like, I have a good spouse, like, that's focusing on the positive. But I think there was that phrase that she used of what you're fixated on in the present, and thinking like, in this moment in time, like, am I fixated on the fact that they helped put the kids to bed or maybe get the kids ready for church? Or am I fixated on how they did it? Like, oh, they didn't pick out the outfit that I would have picked out, right? And how just those little things, like, over time in your marriage kind of layer on and add up to the point where you're 5-10 years down the road. And if you're constantly fixated on, well, you could have done it this way, you should have done it this way, how it would impact for the worse, how it would be a negative impact to your marriage.
No, perspective has such a big impact on your marriage for sure. And it's kind of like going at it with a glass half full or a glass half empty. You can always be looking at it like, oh, I wish we did this differently, or I wish I did this better. But like you said, and like Amy said in the episode, is you get to a point and you look back and you're saying, all I see are regrets. Like I don't see the cherished memories that we have together. And so in the present moment, being intentional about saying like, hey, I'm going to look at the bright side. I'm going to look at what God's doing in this season, even if it wasn't necessarily how I wanted it to turn out, but I can look at it for what it is and appreciate that.
Yeah. I felt challenged from her to, I want to be able to look back in 5-10 years and look back on a memory or a moment and say, what do I remember from that moment? Like, was it something positive from that moment, or did I fixate on something negative in that moment?
That's great. Now, next up on my list, I have this quote from Juli Slattery. It was one of our earlier episodes, so let's go ahead and tune in. Juli, one of the things that you said when you were leading a retreat with us here at WinShape was this idea that sex in your marriage is kind of like a box of Legos.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, so I use that example and I say, hey, when you get like a set of Legos, you see a very cool picture on the outside of the box. You see like a castle or a really cool car. And when you open the box of Legos, you don't expect that you're going to find that completed project. Instead, you're going to find, hundreds of pieces that make no sense to you, and you have to learn to put them together. And that actually the beauty of the gift of Legos is not the completed project. It's the fun of navigating the building. And it's the fact that you get to be creative. You build, you tear down, you build again, you build something new. And that we need to think of sex more like that. That it's not going to be, instant pleasure and love and unity, but it actually will feel a lot more like a box of Legos where you're like, I have no idea even where to start with this. But to welcome that journey and that process of we get to learn how to build a great sex life. And it's maybe take years. It's going to take some help and some resources, but we're going to find great joy, not just in the completed project, but actually in the journey of building.
And I really love that idea of sex being like a box of Legos, but I think it isn't just sex. I think this applies to so many different aspects of marriage. Of course, like you look at this picture on the outside of the box and you think, oh, when I open the box, that's just what it's going to be, you know? And I think in marriage, we can easily watch movies or see TV shows and think, oh, like I'm going to step into marriage and it's just going to be perfect and everything's going to be great. And we'll be happily ever after. And the reality is marriage is kind of like the Legos in the box. Like you have to build them and piece them together and figure out what works and what things don't work. And sometimes you'll find things that don't work and you'll have to go back and maybe go back a couple of steps and say like, how can we do this differently? But the thing that's important is you have some picture on what you're working towards. Like if you were to have a bunch of random Legos and have no picture of where you're going, like you're kind of confused and saying like, okay, like we see a bunch of random pieces, but we don't know what we're building. And in a similar fashion, I think in marriage, it's so important to have that common shared vision and say like, hey, this is what we want our marriage to look like in 10 years, to look like in 15 years, to have that picture so that when you're actually building and working and growing together, you have something that you know that you're working towards collectively and not just two individual ideas of, hey, this is my picture on the box, this is your picture on the box. Let's work towards that. But instead to say like, no, we have a unified vision and we're working towards that, which I think is really important.
I actually hadn't thought of it that way. I had thought of her quote and her example in the context of sex, which is how she described it, which I still think is obviously very great, true and applicable. But I love how you took that example and kind of imagined it even differently into how, what's the picture of, what's the vision of our marriage? And like, how are we building our Lego set to match that vision? So I love how your brain was thinking about that differently.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I do think it is a great analogy for sex too, this idea of, hey, like we're not experts at this at all. Like we have to step in and figure it out and build and work together. But it's true, like you have to have some semblance of like where you're going. And so that's where it's helpful to have couples that have been in a similar situation or have been maybe a little bit further down the line to speak into like, hey, this is what you probably don't realize you're going to want to know in 10 years, but you want to know in 10 years, you know? And absolutely. So I think that's a helpful guide for sure.
Was that your last one, or did you have any?
That was my last one.
That was your last one? Yeah, this is my last one too. Every single episode, there were so many good nuggets from each. It was so hard to really narrow it down without making this episode extra long. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So I definitely think, go back and listen to any of the episodes that you've missed because we really did have some good ones. But I'm going to end on this one. This was the episode that you had with Scott Kedersha talking about I think it was 6 things, 6 mistakes couples make that struggle or something.
6 common characteristics of couples who struggle.
Okay, good. Yeah, I didn't host it, so good. I'm glad you remembered. But one of the things he talked about was that couples who struggle are bored. So we'll take a listen to what he had to say.
You talk about being bored and how that can impact your marriage. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I've seen this one play out in my marriage so significantly, and I've seen it in all of my friends as well. Before we get married, we're super creative, we're fun, we have more time. We're trying to impress each other, and so we do things that are out of the box, creative. We date, we pursue, we're romantic. Newlyweds, we start doing the same thing, and then you get further down the road, kids come along, life gets busier, and you just fall into ruts, and you no longer pursue your spouse. You no longer romance them. You no longer go on dates, and you just get bored. And it's just day in, day out routine of kids and bills and jobs. And you no longer have this excitement or spark in your marriage. And, Ecclesiastes 9:9 says, enjoy life with the wife whom you love. All the days he's given you on this earth. Enjoy life with one another. And we just stop enjoying it.
Yeah, I think this is such a good one to end on too, because you don't want to be bored in your marriage,
That's true.
And, if you're listening to this podcast, then you probably don't want, you also fall into that category of you don't want to be bored in your marriage, which is why you're listening and figuring out things you can do to strengthen your relationship. But I love how he was just saying just this idea of intentionality. And, are you being intentional about romancing your spouse? Are you being intentional about going on dates with them? And, are you sitting there just twiddling your thumbs? And are you finding yourself in a season of boredom? And if so, that is something to pay attention to because it can lead to some frustration. And so if you can figure out ways to just intentionally get out of that rut together, then you maybe can find yourself on the other side of what this episode was, which were couples that are struggling.
And I think this is a really good challenge for those listening to say, okay, let's try to avoid being bored. What are some things that we can do to get outside of our comfort zone, to try different date ideas? And thankfully, our marriage team here has put together quite a comprehensive list of different date ideas or conversation starters to make sure that you don't get to that place of feeling bored and feeling like we're just stuck in the same routines and rhythms and eventually just getting tired of that. And so I would encourage anyone listening, go on to winshapemarriage.org and check out some of those date ideas. We have plenty of fun ones for pretty much every season.
Yes.
Pretty much every activity, rainy days, whatever it may be.
Yes.
We have a list there. So definitely check those out if you haven't already.
Yeah. You definitely will not find yourself bored.
That is true.
Reading through that list.
Yeah.
Rob, it has been such a great season of the WinShape Marriage Podcast. I have had so much fun with you as my co-host and talking to all these different experts and things, but also just enjoyed the conversations that we've got to have with one another too.
Yeah, Marlee, it's been great. And I've really enjoyed the conversations both with you and with guests. And I think we can all walk away from this season with really actionable marriage advice that we can use to hopefully walk away with a stronger marriage after listening to each episode. So I've enjoyed it for sure.
Yeah. And thank you guys so much for tuning in this season on the WinShape Marriage Podcast. We have had so much fun. We hope you guys have enjoyed it. We encourage you to go back and take a listen to any episodes that you have missed. And we're not going anywhere. We will be back with a season 3 of the WinShape Marriage Podcast later this year. So stay tuned for that. But for now, we'll sign off for season 2.
Yeah.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this conversation, make sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more marriage resources. And let us know what you think of this episode in the comments below.